Member and members of the committee, it is truly an honor to be here today. We have a housing crisis in Washington State. If my adult children were still teenagers, they might respond to that assertion by saying either duh or okay, Captain Obvious. It is true. Simply put, there are nowhere near enough housing units to meet the unstimulated demand, be they single-family residences or condos or apartments or whatever. There are just not. This is true of homeless shelters, low-income housing, affordable housing, workforce housing, and yes, even market rate housing. It is true in urban, suburban, and rural communities. There is simply an ocean's difference between demand and supply. And it's a nationwide phenomenon. It's not just us. However, it is particularly bad here, and we should take note. An apples-to-apples comparison of comparable data reveals that Washington State has the 49th worst ratio of housing units per household of any state in the nation. Indeed, we were 50th for quite some time. We just inched past Connecticut. We're the bottom of the pile. When I had the honor to serve in the United States Congress, I was on the Financial Services Committee, which was the Committee of Jurisdiction for Housing. I also chaired something called the Housing Task Force of the new Dem Coalition. And many years ago, we produced this report, Missing Millions of Homes, and it documented the significant housing supply nationally in our country. It also documented the fact that we've been going backward every year since the Great Recession. When I became Lieutenant Governor, we hired a brilliant research fellow from Columbia University. Her name is Alina Lagani. She's originally from Spokane, I might add. Alina has since graduated at the very top of her class in the College of Economics at Columbia University and received a Rhodes Scholar. And while she was with us, she produced 2 reports. Both, frankly, due to surprising demand, are now out of print, but they are available at our website. The first was entitled Washington State's Affordability Crisis. And basically what it did is reduce to our state the same data that we had generated nationally. And the second report is entitled The Racial Wealth Gap is the Housing Gap. That is such an important statement, I'm going to repeat it. The racial wealth gap is the housing gap. More about that later. Lastly, one more report of relevance. Thanks to your support, and I am grateful, the Legislative Committee on Economic Development and International Relations, which I have the privilege to chair, was provided with the resources to do a first-in-a-decade update of our business competitiveness, and this is that report. Part of that report was a statewide survey of economic development professionals in which we asked them what their opinion is of the top barriers to economic growth. The number 1 barrier? Yep, lack of housing. The cold truth is that the dire shortage of housing creates a multitude of problems in addition to holding back economic growth. Housing shortages harm the environment, strange as that may seem, as families are forced to move farther and farther away from where they work to either rent or buy. And of course, that's more sprawl, means more pavement, means more stormwater runoff, the leading cause of pollution of Puget Sound. It means more tailpipe pollution. Housing shortages reduce retirement security. We don't tend to think of a housing supply shortage in that term, but it is in fact the case. Because when homes become so expensive due to lack of supply, then young people are forced to defer their purchase of their first home. And of course, what that means is at the end of their journey, they have less equity because they've had home ownership for a less long period of time. Housing supply shortages reduce standards of living, pure and simple. When families cannot afford to buy a home, they stay renting. Occupancies go up, rents go up, more people become cost burden, and they make some very hard financial trade-offs. Fourthly, housing shortages increase homelessness. Study after study, peer-reviewed, have reached this conclusion. It is the leading cause. Yes, there are complicating issues such as mental health and substance abuse, but the main cause, the primary cause of homelessness is pure and simple, a lack of affordable housing, period. And finally, housing shortages, especially the lack of affordable housing, exacerbate the racial wealth gap. This is because of an inarguable web of facts, and here they are. Historically, black families, as you know, and other minorities have been systematically shut out of the opportunity to buy homes they could afford. Remember that, they could afford these as a result of racist covenants with language so ugly it is hard to read. Denying access to home ownership is denying the opportunity to build home equity. Home equity is the #1 asset of the average American. And as a consequence, there has been far less intergenerational wealth to pass on to the heirs of BIPOC families, wealth that in turn, by the way, makes it easier for a path of home ownership. So as a consequence of all of this, in Washington, about 1/3 of black families own their home. About 2/3 of white families do. As a consequence, again, given that home equity is the #1 asset of the average American, black families have, you're hearing this correctly, about 1/8 the net worth of the average white family. 1/8. These are the facts. These are the painful facts. And here's the painful truth. We did this. We did this. The financial services industry did this through its lending practices. The real estate profession did this through its practices. I cannot help but note how infinitely admirable I think it is that the real estate profession is here today to stand up for this legislation. It should be noted. And local and state governments and the federal government did this through their practices. We did this. We did this. And we can undo it. And I hope you will. Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. Any questions?